know we talked about in some of the previous episodes some of the things that we did to kind of get away from the boardwalk or get away from the war by going to the boardwalk and having cigar night and stuff like that. Well, on the Fridays when we did cigar night, we would typically get food at a place called the Kebab House. And I discovered the story behind it is the guy that opened the Kebab House, he moved to the States from Afghanistan in 1999. He was born in the South. He moved up to Kabul, and then he moved to Albany, New York. And then in 2006, he got on a contract as a linguist for the SEALs. He speaks Farsi, Pashto, Urdu, and English. So he was very much an asset to them. Well, he ended up opening the Kebab House in 2008, and anybody that has eaten there will tell you that the food is phenomenal. There's not a bad thing on the menu. It's absolutely amazing. I was doing a little, what's going on in the world today news search for Afghanistan, and my hometown paper, the Fayetteville Observer in Fayetteville, North Carolina, had a story about him because it turns out in December, he opened up that same kebab house in Fayetteville. So to anybody that listens to this, go eat there. The food is phenomenal. And I don't know what, he's probably charging American prices now, and it's going to absolutely be worth it. I just wanted to throw that out there because I thought that was really cool that this part of Kandahar came back to the States. And if you're in the right position, Stu, you can go eat there.
Stu's the only one of us brave enough to live in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
I'm about 2 hours away. Okay, well, Wilmington's a little cooler, less methy. But I have occasion to go up there. I'll have to check it out. Maybe do a TikTok review for the channel or some such thing.
Do an on location Boardwalk podcast.
Jeez.
Yeah, no, probably not since China just admitted to like how much they're stealing from people on there. But
dude, why does China need access to jiggling ass and titties on TikTok?
That's what it's for, I guess.
Have you ever wondered that?
The world will never know.
And that's like 90% of the content it serves me, but it must be just because that's what I like.
We'll probably find out in the next 50 years.
The algorithm has me figured out. The algorithm's got me figured out, boys.
All right, welcome back to the Boardwalk, episode 11, where we'll be talking about the various air assets that were utilized in Afghanistan and some details regarding how they were allocated and the pros and the cons of all those assets, going from our intelligence collection to close air support. With us today, we've got another friend of ours, Adam Mazel, who was the ISR MAT in Kandahar. So Adam, thanks for joining us. Do you want to tell everybody who you are real quick and what you did over there?
Hey, sure, Zach. Yeah, thanks, Zach, Stu, and Kyle for having me. I did have the privilege of serving with you guys, and then I'm currently enjoying digesting your podcast, although I got to confess that I think I'm just finished the line of Kandahar with Razik on my commute to work the other day. So I still got a lot to go, but it's nice because I can kind of binge it. But yeah, as you said, I served on the ISR MAT program as an advisor. So prior to that, my first time in Afghanistan was as an intelligence officer. Basically went for a 1-year deployment, mostly out of Bagram. Kind of served two roles there. One is the Fusion Intelligence Cell, kind of OIC, which really just meant I was compiling the commanding general for RCE's read book. It was kind of a fairly miserable job, but a good way to sort of learn the lay of the land. And then RC East, we changed that mission from ISAF to Resolute Support. And since I was on a 1-year tour as an individual, I stayed on and then became a targeting officer for a much smaller area. So basically just for the Bagram base ground defense area. But in that process, I was kind of a customer for ISR. So kind of an interesting perspective going from the customer to someone advising on how to integrate that. After I did that, I came back to the States, got on the ISR MAT program, and I know you had Nick Lopez on there before. Did 2 rotations with that in Kandahar and then in Herat in Western Afghanistan, and worked with you guys in supporting both the Texas Guard and the previous units. I think you all overlapped with General Agudo, and that was 7th. Was that 7th or 9th Division? I forget.
It was 7th Infantry Division preceded the Texas Guard, but the 7th Infantry Division, I know they preceded me and Stu. Did they precede you, Kyle?
Oh yeah, I believe so. Unless didn't they have some remnants still there in the SIGINT cell?
I think so, because when we got there, I think the Texas guys are fairly new.
Okay, yeah. So basically, kind of worked with 2 different collection managers there, and then worked with a whole host of some of those subordinate units. But did a lot of work with the Afghans and tried to teach them the fundamentals of ISR collection and how to use some of their resources, with mixed results. But be happy to get into that as well with you.
I would like to get into that.
I love that.
Before we get into that, can you kind of just real quick, the bird's eye view, what is an ISR MAT's role, especially as it related to Resolute support?
Sure, yeah. So the ISR MAT program, since we're throwing around acronyms, so it's the Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance Mobile Advisory Team, and it was actually set up through the Army's Training and Doctrinal Command through their intelligence directorate, and they sort of saw this sort of yawning gap in Afghanistan of how the units were integrating these ISR assets, to help with the intelligence collection process. So what they did was they basically created a contract that had a whole host of advisors that were embedded. I think it started in, I want to say around 2009 or so. So it was around for a bit. Obviously, we're kind of shutting the lights off in Afghanistan now, so I'm not really sure what the future is there. But the intent was to have 1 or 2 of these advisors who could be at a headquarters, at Resolute Support, at one of the Train Advise Assist commands, and work with that command's G2 cell to kind of get the most out of not just the platforms and collection assets that they had, but also some of the other units that are with them, whether it's special operations or also some of the fancier assets, basically theater level and higher assets that were sometimes available. So think like U-2 spy planes, some of the bigger drones, and people might know about Global Hawk and some of those larger ones that are available to a larger theater than just in Afghanistan, are sort of parsed out based on the request. So really, we were there to kind of help the G2 intelligence folks and the analysts integrate some of those capabilities if we could get them into both the intelligence collection process and the targeting collection process to feed operations.
So I was, when we first got there, for the listeners, there's about 6 people that we worked with named Matt. And for about 6 weeks, I thought your name was Matt. And we designated you ISR Matt because we had ISR Matt, we had Marine Matt, we had Zobel Matt. I just assumed your name was Matt. And then one day I heard Mick call you Adam. I'm like, who the fuck is Adam? And he's like, that's Adam. So no, his name's Matt. And he goes, no, he's the ISR Matt. Oh, okay. So that was my introduction to the ISR Matt program, was assuming that your name was Matt because we worked with a half dozen people named Matt.
I don't even know if we had a Matt on the contract, but you'd think that we would have done that by then.
We had plenty of them scattered throughout. Both of the people I lived with were named Matt, for hell's sake. Thanks for the intro. I think that is going to help out because I could not explain the ISR Matt program, or I couldn't even explain ISR. I know how to use it. I know how to task and stuff like that, but that's about it. Kyle, you when we were talking about this, you seemed you got super giddy about this topic. I guess you and Adam are just peas in the pod when it comes to ISR and being tasked and tasking and all that.
Yeah,
so
I got tasked a lot.
I'm gonna defer to you guys to kind of lead this, and Stu and I will chime in with our peon questions.
So yeah, just a background. Maybe I covered it in the first episode, maybe, but I worked for Task Force Thor, which was a derivative, I guess, an offshoot of Joint Task Force Odin, which was actually stood up in Iraq, first of all, to counter IEDs, so to counter insurgents placing IEDs on the roads. It was very successful counterterrorism, counter IED mission, and then they stood up a Joint Task Force Odin in Afghanistan as kind of a broad aerial surveillance and reconnaissance group. And one of the, I guess, the smaller offshoots of that was Task Force Thor, who I worked for. So we flew in the Mars project, which is a mid-altitude reconnaissance and surveillance system. I believe there's like 2 S's in there. So we flew on these modified King Air 350s. So I conducted signals intelligence. It was a 4-man crew. You had a pilot who also served as a mission commander. You had a co-pilot, and you had a camera operator and a signals intelligence guy in the back. So I did signals intelligence, and the Mars platform is an ISR platform. So we were able to, do anything from providing reconnaissance and surveillance to guys actually on the ground in a mission, to being able to use signals intelligence and imagery to find and find, fix, finish. I guess that's what they like to say. But we couldn't really finish the target. We had to kind of paint the target, and then somebody carrying a missile could finish them. But that's generally how it worked. So Matt was one of the ISR Matts, and the Adams of the world were the ones tasking me out. So we would take off and go wherever we were told to go. So yeah, it was an interesting time, and I probably the best job I ever had. It was like that scene in Fury, when they're all in the tank and they tap on the walls of the tank, like best job I ever had. That's true. I mean, I'd do it again with all those guys in a heartbeat. If I could get a guarantee, that's all I'd do, and not like sexual harassment training or something. I'd do it again. Good times.
What I remember from our ISR capabilities, and this is not a knock on Adam or anybody involved with the ISR or the ISR MAT program or anything like that. What I remember is just how impossible it seemed to get collection on, especially for us as analysts. We wanted, for the most part, grids. We'd get a report that there's a Taliban bed down location, and insert various grid number, and so you would designate that as an NAI, a named area of interest, and you would send it up the channel to be collected upon. And the biggest issue with being in that train, advise, and assist role is that, and we talked about it a little bit last week, is our resources were greatly depleted to what they had been prior to that train, advise, assist. So I would submit 15, 20, 30 grids, and I might get half of them flown in a week. And that was super frustrating. But at the same time, you got people like Adam who are trying to advise and help out with the Afghans. And I can only imagine how well they were picking up the concept of unmanned aerial vehicles and getting pictures from a giant bird in the sky.
Yeah, no, I thought what I would do, kind of, you and Kyle sort of touched on it, is take a step back and kind of talk about the ideal collection process. So obviously, the U.S. is really fond of just doctrinating the shit out of things and creating ideal spaces for our military bureaucratic systems to function. And it's not all bad. I think, the fact that we have manuals and processes for everything is not a bad thing. We tend to throw them out when it comes to conflict, but when you go back to them, sometimes they are useful. And with that process act that providing grids and probably banging your head against the wall, trying to get, the actual collection back from, the idea is that when you have a ground commander, he wants to know about the enemy, and that's the responsibility of, the G2. And so his priority intelligence requirements are spelled out, in consultation with the G2. And from there, you're building questions that you want answered through intelligence collection means. So the Army calls them specific information requirements, and then from there they're broken down into things that you can actually collect on. So in the case of Kyle mentioned the Mars platform having both a signals capability and I don't remember if it was full motion video or the electro optical or the sort of all weather. It was all. Yeah.
Yeah, it was FMV.
Yeah,
It had
so in the
all of
case
them
of the
on it.
Mars, I mean, you've got a multi-int platform that can, kind of look across a variety of different things. So I mean, the presence of bad dudes visibly to, looking at the more technical means of how they're communicating. Uh, so you're building that collection plan and eventually getting to this point where it's like, well, what do I want to see or what do I want to observe, and how am I going to find out, things that validate my, the general's priority intelligence requirements, and then you get to the actual tasking of the resources. So you obviously want to task something. You're not going to, if you're looking for radio chatter between Taliban, you're not going to, get that from one of our inflatable balloons with a video camera on it. And so making sure those assets are tasked properly was something that I tried to work on with the collection manager. So within the G2, within that intelligence cell, there's an individual, usually I think almost always, although I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in some cases it may have been a contractor. In the case of TAC South, it was a green suitor, typically an intelligence NCO, so staff sergeant or sergeant first class, who was responsible and had a section that would take all these collection requests, help build them so they aligned to what was needed to collect on those intelligence requirements, and then kind of look and find those assets, because TAC South had things that were organic to them, and they had capabilities that they could kind of draw on if they were available. So in theory, that's how it's supposed to work. And Zach, you mentioned you kind of draw this box, this named area of interest of where you're looking. You task an asset to kind of look there using whichever collection means it has, whether it's through video surveillance, through signals, through other technical collection means, and you're trying to continue to build a picture. So with a multi-int platform, you can do that especially well, because you can task the same asset to kind of queue other intelligence collection methods, and you're building that bigger picture that either leads you to, hopefully, kind of putting that warhead on a forehead and either have a kinetic strike or direct coalition or partnered military forces to go and act on that objective. So theoretically, that's how it's supposed to work. In reality, it became quite a mess. And Zach, you're fair to point out that I ended up doing a lot of work more advising the Afghans, because it was frustrating to see how the process was abused, a lot because of multiple misunderstandings, I think, of what ISR was used for and how to use it effectively. We can get into, I have plenty of examples. I think one of the best ones I'll bring up fairly quickly, and I forget if it preceded you guys, but there was a commanding general of TAC South who essentially asked for an asset to fly over the Afghan forces who were conducting offensive operations against the Taliban, and they were using it to verify whether or not they were actually moving to the objective they were supposed to. So they were literally using this asset and putting full motion video, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this was an armed unmanned asset. So there's sort of this fetishization of the Reaper and the Gray Eagles and anything that has missiles on it, and they kind of wanted to have it, in case they could authorize a strike on something. But using this, this multi-million-dollar asset in a way that it's not really designed for, and also shows, I think, the general lack of trust we had in the ANA, that in the morning, flying over, making sure that it's like, oh, okay, there they are, they're doing personal hygiene, they're getting ready, but it was that bizarre verification that was being used, rather than actually pushing it maybe a little forward to see what the Taliban was up to, and then eventually providing that information to the Afghans.
I remember on more than one occasion coming into the JOC, and there's an asset, and it's on like a checkpoint along the Kandahar Ruzgan highway, and like, why are we shooting that? And like, just to see if anybody's there. Like, that's a waste of an asset. They're clearly not there. Like,
I spend at least 50% of my missions, I think, staring at rocks. I'm not even joking. Like, and Adam, you talked a little bit about just the wasting of assets and just how horrible it got to be. So basically, we were contracted out to like certain flights. We had like 16 flights, I guess, when we were doing the program. And it closed down the year I left. I was the last ones to do that mission for the Army. It was a joint Army Air Force thing. So basically, like X number of flights a day were tasked out to whatever the main task force there, the counterterrorism task force. We had a one bird tasked out, at least one or two, to Task Force 606, which was the British SAS working in Kabul. And then we had some tasked out to Special Forces training, advising the Afghan guys. So, like, our birds would only, support those customers. Well, if the customers didn't have a specific mission to run, they would make up some sort of mission to run. They'd be like, I need you to go stare at this. Well, why? Well, because it's a use it or lose it kind of thing. They were afraid that if they didn't send that bird up, that somebody would be like, hey, you guys aren't using that bird, so we need it. So it's basically they would come up with BS taskings for you to do just to keep the asset so they can use it the next day if they needed it. So yeah, I probably spent 50% of my mission staring at rocks and like burning all that fuel, just turning dollars into fuel.
That is a
good times.
That is a Department of Defense wide issue right there. I don't know how many times I heard my company commander say, we've got to throw a big ass party at the end of the year because we don't spend this money, we don't get it next year. Like that, and that starts at the company level. It goes all the way up to the division level. In my case, I was at a corps. It goes to the corps level. And so, yeah, I'm not at all surprised to hear that you have that same issue going on with multi-million-dollar assets that cost thousands of dollars to fly per hour, dropping $150,000 missiles on dudes with $200 rifles. I'm not at all surprised that that's happening.
It's pretty ironic that the best way to justify your program to Congress is to waste taxpayer money. That's seems to be a trend.
Can you talk about that from like a tasking point of view though, Adam? Because I'm telling you, it gets boring. You learn a lot about the guys you fly with on 6-hour missions staring at rocks, man. I think I can tell you everything about anybody I flew with.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you learned a lot about rocks too. Make you a certified Afghan geologist at this point. Yeah, I mean the reality is it shouldn't be like that. But what happens and actually putting my my customer hat back on when I was the targeting officer at ComBAF, with Third ID, we would potentially lose assets if we were. So there was and I forget the terminology, but there was essentially you would bid on collection assets, and you would bid for certain times to get assets that were outside of your that were not organic to you, because everyone was in such competition for assets. And what's strange is, I think we had quite a lot. I think, I actually, when I was kind of brought on to talk about this, I found an old article draft I was writing, and I called it "Drowning in Drones," because we have all these assets and we just abuse what they're actually meant to be used for. But what we would have to do at ComBAF is our collection management and dissemination folks, the ISR people, there was like a bidding board essentially, and weekly there'd be a certain number of assets that were not organic to that level, but could be bid on across Afghanistan, and if you weren't using what you got, you may not get it again. So it created these weird situations where you're bidding for certain times, but they're not lined up to the necessary collection times of what you're looking for. So you could be targeting a specific compound or a specific dude, and you might have gotten a Gray Eagle or a Reaper or another unmanned aircraft, or maybe even a Mars or another fixed wing aircraft. But only for a certain time, and that's outside of your time frame that you're even looking for. So you find yourself in what Kyle, you said, where you're getting tasked to do things that is essentially busy work. And the other thing that I saw, and I saw this much more in TAC South, and it had a nice fancy name that made it sound better, was dynamic retasking. So you had something, Yeah, yeah. Everyone's kind of giggling over there because it sounds like, oh, it sounds dynamic retasking. We're going to move these assets, and yeah, well, you're moving assets out of a collection plan, and you're moving them to do things. Um, Most of the time, it was, I think, for the jock to get a better look on things. So they would take a platform that may have, video capability um, and use it solely for that, even if it was a signals platform as well, even if it was tasked to a very specific collection platform to build objectives or target development in the long term, to build support for the ANDSF. Um, to provide situational awareness on longer term issues. And so I called it the soda straw effect because there are so many, I hate to say it's mostly the maneuver type guys who wanted to, they're stuck in these jocks and they're like, well, I want to see what's going on. And maybe if I'm lucky, we can launch a kinetic strike. And they did. I don't think do you guys remember the recoilless rifle ones? They're blowing up recoilless rifles and calling it a win.
That doesn't surprise me, man.
Yeah. So
Yeah, good shot.
A lot of resources.
How much was
to
that
take out a
rifle versus how
rifle.
much?
yeah, so not just the waste of that missile, but the waste of an asset. And I think another problem is that some of these if every ISR asset had weapons on it, we'd never get collection done because they would just be grabbed purely to kind of look around and find something to blow up. So I tended to like the ones that weren't armed because people wouldn't go after them as much. And it was fairly safe to say, well, Kyle's probably saying, no, they stuck me on Afghan rocks all day long.
It's like, yeah, we were unarmed, but we could still like laze targets and stuff. And we still had a purpose in the stack. And the stack is what we call basically, if they think there's a possibility that something's going to go kinetic or that people on the ground are in contact, they'll do what's called build a stack, and they'll be on the ground this JTAC, and I hate we throw acronyms around like crazy. So he's basically an air traffic controller, but he's also like special forces or Air Force or somebody embedded with the guys on the ground, and he controls the air assets. So like not only does he have to fight, but he also has to be an air traffic controller. It has to be one of the hardest jobs in the military. It has to be because he's always on the radio with us and any asset in the stack. And the stack is like, 500 to 1,000 feet apart. He'll just start stacking drones, things with missiles, unarmed assets to look at things, right? Because if they need it, they need you to laze the target or they need you to do something. And that poor JTAC has to control that whole stack while being shot at. And it's like, it's absolutely, I mean, my hats go out to anybody with a JTAC. I don't know how anybody did that job. But yeah, I mean, on a good day, we'd be in a stack, doing something dynamic. But on most days, we'd be off by ourselves in the middle of the desert. I don't know what we're looking for, but
Adam,
but that's usually how it went.
what was the asset that sounded like a fucking lawnmower in the sky? Do you remember what it was called?
Hunter.
Huh?
I think it was
Hunter
the Hunter.
the Hunter drone?
No,
I don't
wait,
think it
Shadow? Was it the Shadow?
The Hunter
Yes.
drone
Shadow.
isn't.
It was Shadow.
Flying lawnmower.
So
The Hunter was bad.
so as a Kandahar analyst, the big Taliban strongholds were on the edges of the province. So you had Maywan to the west, Maruf to the east, and then Shawali Kot to the north. And we talked a little bit about Mayaneshan last week. And Mayaneshan is just north of Shawali Kot and has been locked down Taliban control for 5 years. Well, Shawali Kot was like the main operating hub for northern Kandahar. So I'd had grids that I'd like to get flown up in Shawali Kot in the Shinartu Valley. And for some reason, they always wanted to fly shadows. And, it doesn't take, Chuck Yeager or a physicist to understand that valleys amplify sound. And so every time they would fly this shadow, I'd get back NISTR, which is NSTR, nothing significant to report. It's like, well, no shit, there's nothing significant to report. They heard you 45 minutes before you showed up. So and that was one of those things. I talked to you. It wasn't you, Adam, but I talked to like a random person I work. It may have been the warrant officer I worked with, and I was like, we can't send shadows up there because it's a valley and it's not going to work. They're going to hear it. We're not going to target these guys. Find, fix, finish, which we shouldn't have been doing anyways. But we're not going to be able to do that if you're sending a fucking lawnmower with wings that you can hear across half the province because it can't fly very high, It's louder than shit. And every single time there's like, nope, we're going to send the shadow up there. So, okay, so the entire time I was there, nothing ever was accomplished in Shawalikot. And that's probably part of why we lost the highway, and the Taliban took the dam recently. So they're doing pretty well up there. And maybe if we'd flown the right assets at the right times, we would have been a little more successful. And I think that's one of the things that is really frustrating. And you brought up like those maneuver guys, the ops versus intel on a jock floor. That is real. That it's not hate, it's not discontent, right? It's just it's conflicting ideas and conflicting goals. And because we're red team, we're trying to figure out what the red team's doing and tell them what the red team's doing. And the ops guys are like, we're trying to maneuver friendly forces to kill the red team. And you create situations where people butt heads, where like you said, there's the dynamic retasking, which is the no child left behind of military terminology. It sounds cool, but it's fucking terrible, and it costs us, collection opportunities. I remember, we'd always put in, we want to get something collected in Maywan, or we want to get something collected maybe even down in the Registan Desert. And they'd come back with, well, yeah, we flew it at noon. It's like nothing happens in Afghanistan at noon. Even in the northern Helmand, the Taliban probably walk around at noon doing what they want. But even in a place like Maywan, that was still pretty heavily, Taliban controlled, they weren't operating until nighttime.
Yeah. And it's fucking hot in the desert. So
yeah, crazy how that works out.
Yeah, I don't know. I think my favorite. I'm pretty sure it was ISR related, but so speaking of looking at rocks, how about shooting rocks with the old terrain denial strikes that they loved to get? Those were the big wins. So essentially, what a terrain denial strike is say you're looking at an area or a map, and you're like, the Taliban aren't here, but if they were, that would be bad. Well, what you do is you fly over it and you shoot rockets, or you use ground artillery, and you just bomb the fuck out of this area. And then the Taliban are like, oh, well, they're bombing the fuck out of this area. I guess we won't go there. Or at least that's the intention. And you just end up like being in the JOC or in the IFC. Just hearing about how we're blowing up a bunch of dirt this week, and be excited about it. It's a real win you're getting there.
There was a lot of terrain denial with turn 2.
Did they do that a lot? Because
Yes.
What a waste of everyone's time. I don't think that actually deterred anything. I don't know if that denied anybody.
I mean, look, Kandahar is not
Stop them
exactly
from taking it for a minute.
Yeah, Kandahar is not exactly the smallest province out there. A terrain denial. If anybody has ever seen, I'm pretty sure most Americans with access to the internet have seen what a drone strike looks like, right? It's not like you're blowing up a square kilometer. It's a relatively small area unless you start bringing out the big munitions. So, we're chucking $130,000 Hellfires at the side of Spingar Mountain north of Kandahar because, the Taliban might use that as a bed down. It's like, okay, they're just going to move 10 feet to the left and use it as a bed down 6 hours after we're done doing that.
Or they're not even using it. Like you don't have to base like intelligence assessments on where you're going to be conducting terrain denial strikes. I think you had a good point there, Zach. Now if we were using Moabs for terrain denial, I think that might have a little a little more change to the battlefield. But yeah, with what we were doing, it was just it was a group of guys that wanted to kill people, but were kind of rendered impotent by the fact that wasn't their fucking job, and they didn't have the means to do it. And so you shoot dirt because damn it, you want to shoot something.
And we even flew out howitzers to so I got to go on a couple of the expeditionary advisory packages, the EAPs, and I'm sure you guys have talked about it at this point, but the whole fly to advise, and I went to I think it was Maywand. It was on the seam between Kandahar and Helmand, and they brought a 777 howitzer, and they brought a bunch of artillery guys so they could conduct these terrain denial fires. And granted, the intent was, okay, we're we're shaping Razak's forces to conduct their operations, so the Taliban won't come this way. But when you think about it, you wonder what intelligence was consulted to say that this would actually serve any purpose. I think people kind of looked at a map and did the I think anyone who's been in the Army is familiar with the Okoko. When you look at you look at your the terrain that you're accustomed to, and you look for your avenues of approach and your cover and concealment. And my guess is someone looked at a map and said, oh, if I was Terry Taliban, like I would come through this valley, so let's just plop a couple rounds there and the artillery guys will get to shoot off some stuff. But then you think in the grander scheme of it as well, did you bring that there specifically so that that were you going to provide actual conventional support? Was that within the rules of engagement or the support to Afghan forces, or were you doing this because you had a bunch of bored maneuver guys who just wanted to be part of an advisory package and get to shoot rounds? And people took turns, guest firing the howitzer. And
they got cabs.
Yeah. Well, they didn't get cabs. Actually, we did. I don't know, because they did fire mortars at the base.
I guarantee you, they got cabs.
I am absolutely that none of this surprises me. I can 100% see us moving a howitzer to a location that doesn't need one, just so people can shoot it, just to get cabs for their enlistment record or officer record. I can 100% see that. 100%. That's the most Army thing I've heard.
Kyle, I think you might have stepped on you. To bring it to a bigger point that ties back to ISR, I think when you look at our time in Afghanistan and you look at the way we conducted operations, you see a competent conventional force trying to make sense of a conflict that the US or NATO that they are not accustomed to executing, but using what they have available to them to try to solve what they think are problems that conventional weapons could achieve effects on. And the tie back to ISR with that is you look at some of the platforms that are on hand, because the US for quite some time built multi-million-dollar projects. I mean, the Defense Department spends these projects take time to develop, and by the time they're fielded, it could be a decade or so before this platform goes from start to finish. And so we had these large ISR assets that were built really for the Cold War, and JSTARS is one of them. And JSTARS, and I forget the actual acronym, it's Joint something Targeting Radar System, something like that. It's basically the equivalent of the Air Force version is the AWACS. So the JSTARS was produced in cooperation with the Army and the Air Force. And the idea was that if the AWACS was sort of a airspace battlefield management system to kind of keep track of where your fighters and bombers were and the enemy's fighters and bombers were. And if you ever want to read a good book, like that's actually fun, Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising talks about those AWACS, and they're kind of really important, and they're why we kind of had an advantage on the Soviets. But the JSTARS had the ground equivalent of that, so really to track large ground formations. Well, it was an asset that was available in Afghanistan often, and we had a Air Force ISR liaison officer, and I think every TAC had one of these, an ISR low, and they're basically echelons above a JTAC. They don't have to worry about getting shot at. They're there to kind of liaise with the TACs and tell them, hey, we have these big fancy platforms that are coming from Kuwait and elsewhere, and that's exactly what the JSTARS was. So some of the things that are on there are ground moving target indicators and a variety of radar based platforms that can really show you lots of ground movement. I think one of the cool things I can do, it can show you changes in pattern of if you put it over a city, you can see the changes in movement over a specific period of time. So it's really good if you're looking at Soviet forces. It's not really great if you're looking at an Afghan town or city where everything is going to look the same. You know, the Taliban isn't exactly driving around in Bradleys or BMPs.
So what you're saying then is that it's great once a year in Kunduz.
Yes. Once a year, it soars. Yeah.
When 1,000 Taliban swarmed the Kunduz provincial capital.
And it's probably been tasked
Yep.
out to Helmand
And that's,
at that
and
point.
that's about the use of it. But that's what we know. And that, I think, pervades not just ISR, but how we conduct ourselves in any of these asymmetric conflicts. I think we're just not we're not mentally primed that way, because we do fetishize technology, and we do look at the other side and say the fact that they have less of it makes them unsophisticated and not good at prosecuting war, when in reality, they're kind of playing us like a fiddle.
All right. So I guess I'll start off this part. For part two, we're going to talk a little bit about close air support, CAS as they call it. It's interesting when I was doing ISR, and we'd have to coordinate with strike assets. At the time I was there, they had gotten rid of the greatest close air support weapon known to man, the A-10 Warthog. I mean, that was no longer flying in Afghanistan. So for most close air support kind of things, they either use drones, Predator drones, or F-16s, F-16s that took off out of Bagram. And so it's interesting that this, over reliance, I think, in the beginning of the war, and as U.S. forces were less and less embedded with Afghan forces, I think that, at least when I was there, I feel like the CAS kind of thing died down a little bit, but I don't know what you guys think.
It was definitely a bigger thing towards the beginning of the war. If you watch any of those documentaries, like pre-2010, and you got like an infantry platoon that's walking through a fucking opium field, and you start hearing AKs firing off in the background. They get behind a ditch, and after about 45 minutes, you hear somebody call for CAS, and you got an A-10 Warthog, which is the slowest, fattest airplane ever, but holy fuck, will it rip somebody into two pieces really quick. And everybody gets really happy, and then the fighting stops. And I think over time, not even over time, it didn't take very long to figure out that, this is this is effective. If we got A-10s in the air, they stopped shooting at us. And so we became super reliant on calling in A-10s. And like you said, Kyle, eventually those left. So we had F-16s. The Afghan Air Force has their A-29s, which are, they work for Afghanistan, but outside of Afghanistan, A-29s are not very useful.
A little outdated, but you can make the same case for the A-10, as far as outdated.
I fucking love the A-10. In case anyone doesn't know, the A-10 is a giant gun that they built a plane around, and it's slow, it's super loud, but when it comes in, it goes brrr, and it just makes people evaporate.
Yeah, the A-10 is certainly not in a, let's say, hypothetically, we had a modern war against, Russia. We're not deploying A-10s, right? But, the Taliban or Al-Shabaab or, insert various Islamic extremist group that is not, official head of state, the A-10 is going to work out just fine for a good period of time.
It's funny because the A-10 was originally designed to go up against the Soviets. I don't know if you know that they built the crew compartment. It was in a titanium bathtub, essentially. They're extremely survivable. Maybe not nowadays with some of the more recent, advances in air defense systems, but the Gulf War, I think there was one that had one of its engines and part of its wing shot off, and it still landed. And it's crazy to think that. But the Afghans have the A-29, so it's. Originally, there was a push for the U.S. to replace the A-10 with something like that, because there were people who saw, especially I think in the SOF community, these wars aren't going away. If it's not Afghanistan, we'll probably end up somewhere else. And there is a need for that light attack, close air support in an environment where you don't have adversaries that have adequate air defense systems. Although I think now, I don't know, things are. I think those days are over. I think there's a lot more proliferation of that.
I was going to say, Adam, yeah, it seems like there's definitely a lot of proliferation of these surface-to-air missiles, especially with how plentiful they were made, particularly in the Cold War states. And I'm sure that anybody that wants one could get one. So,
oh yeah, I mean, yeah, it was always huge. If you got a report that there was a stinger in Afghanistan, I mean, number one, it's not true, but number two, people would get really spun up about it.
Oh,
we got spun up about every one of them. Yeah,
well,
flying around, we got spun up.
Oh, okay. I say, yeah, I didn't get spun up about it. I remember
you guys
the boss coming in. They found a stinger. Like, there's no fucking stingers here, sir. Don't worry about it. But the report says, I don't care what the report says. It's not true. There's no fucking stingers here.
But when your flight briefing has it.
Oh, I know. So I ran into that
puckering, dude.
When I left the KIF seat. I did the 2 months with the aviation guys. And the guy before me, good analyst. I am by no means putting him down. He's a really good analyst. He had a year of experience. I had 10. And so I see things a little differently, right? Like I'd been to a war before and all that jazz. And so I remember going through the intel reports, and I would build the slides. And I wasn't as doomy and gloomy when it came to things like stingers and recoilless rifles, because chances are they weren't true, right? So I kind of bumped heads a few times with the aviators the first couple briefings I did, and they like you said, Kyle. I understand that it's a lot different when you're up in the sky. I completely get that. I'm also an analyst who has to understand the trends, right? And the trends don't support this theory. So I had to learn to eventually say, there's this report that says that there's a stinger, 30 miles north of Kandahar city. It's probably not true, but here's the grid location, just so you know that that's where they say it is. And that seems to put people at ease. I don't know.
Yeah, if anything, like stinger reports could be used to justify getting ISR for an area that you already wanted covered. That was probably the best case scenario as an analyst. Like, I mean, the Taliban have been, in this area for a while, according to all these reports, and also there's a stinger, and you get it like that. So it
I should have started. I should have became a source for like Task Force Black. And started throwing out just, hey, by the way, there's a stinger over here. Maybe that would have gotten me a little more, collection in my area.
I think the funniest was when this happened more in Bagram and surrounding areas, that I don't think we did a very good job of cataloging the locations of like derelict anti-air systems left over from the before times, the Soviet times, and so we get all sorts of spinning up by people who were not intelligence people, mostly from the jock there, saying, "Oh my God, there's a ZSU, like one of these anti-aircraft cannons. We see it. I mean, we saw it on one of our the PTIDs, the big floating balloons that have cameras on them, and yeah, they turn out to be kind of like the museum pieces that were in front of the Bagram headquarters, but they've been sitting there for 20 years. We were chasing Scuds at one point in Panjshir." And I thought that was the funniest thing I think I ever encountered on my first deployment, was that there were reports of Scuds and a fear that these Scuds would fall into Taliban hands. They were in Panjshir province, which I'm sure you guys are talking about how, I mean, this is the heart of the anti-Taliban, like the Northern Alliance, Ahmed Shah Massoud. This is their territory. There's no Taliban there.
Panjshir will be the last place to fall.
Yeah. Well, number two, these things that when we did get, and we did have to get a tasking was put out, an ISR asset flew over something. I don't remember what it was. Probably a theater level asset, so even more of a waste of money. And you look at the images, and these things they're not even, there's no missile on the launcher. The cabin for the for the crew for the actual vehicle part to move it is separate. I mean, these things have been sitting there rusting for 20 years, and here we are getting all worked up about that. One would think, you kind of like drop a little pin on your map and say, hey, we looked at this, but I guess not.
To be fair, I've seen them I've seen real ones, ZPUs on truck beds, and
I think you say
ZPU
scuds.
4. Oh no, I'm sorry, no, definitely
On a
not
short
scuds.
bed
No,
too.
never saw one of those. These people put a ZPU in the back of a truck, and I still remember that's one of the craziest strikes I've ever been part of. Because, like, I mean, maybe you mentioned this earlier, Adam, but there's like certain weapons that'll pretty much guarantee sign your death warrant the minute they're like unfurled. And this guy had one just camped on a roadside with a ZPU in the back of his truck, and somebody found it in the middle of the day. They're like, buddy, it's over for you, bud. You and anybody
Yeah.
there with you. Sure enough, they blew him up, man. Nothing will get you killed faster than having a giant anti-aircraft gun in the back of your truck.
Yeah,
Like,
that's a
it
pretty
was
good day
wild.
for the jock. Like you get super excited if you find a dish guy, at one of these places. So finding a Zeus, that's definitely a lot of happy ops guys.
Yeah, but now when you look at CAS, it's going to take on a whole new role because for the most part, most of the Americans are gone, including the commanding general. Which, as a quick aside, that feels like quitting. I don't know. It feels like he was going to be there till August 31st, and now General Miller's like, oh, I'm stepping down now. And the guy that runs CENTCOM is also going to oversee the retrograde. Well, actually, it's going to be his 2-star Navy admiral. That's weird. That seems like quitting to me. I don't know. You guys might disagree.
Does it seem like quitting to you, Adam?
I mean, I think if they had made the military attaché in charge, that'd be a real red flag. But I don't know a good, and he's been commander now for 3 years.
He is the longest tenured commander in Afghanistan.
The other day, I Googled, I wanted to find him in his dress uniform to see how many overseas service bars. Like, it's past his elbow. He has the bars
Seriously?
going all the way up past. Yeah, I think he's, well, because he's been an old hand. He actually spent time, he was the ground force commander during the Battle of Mogadishu, the Black Hawk Down incident.
Wow. Oh, dang, that's a long time in, man.
General,
yeah,
I don't say that in any way to besmirch General Miller. He seems like a decent enough fellow. I understand the like all the news articles say it's like a symbolic passing of the torch, and I'm like, I thought that was going to be August 31st when we formally left, but that's neither here nor there. What I wanted to bring up was with this transition, and we were talking about it a little bit during the break. There aren't American or NATO assets in Afghanistan to help maintain the Afghan Air Force. And so, one, they'll be reliant upon the skills that hopefully they picked up while we were there. Two, I brought it up, it sounds like they'll be using the UAE for a lot of their maintenance and support maintenance and support needs. That's the word, support needs. So that's kind of a journey to pull a helicopter from Afghanistan to the UAE and keep it out of the fight for an extended period of time. So they're going to lose some of that immediate ability to become air ready again or air capable. The bigger issue, have you guys seen this? I saw a news article that in the last 2 or 3 months, 7 Afghan Air Force pilots have been killed by the Taliban. Right, deliberately targeted in their homes or in the streets or just out and about. So the Taliban understands that they can't match up to air assets. Right now, Stu, you brought up that there was a Taliban Air Force at one point when the Taliban ran the Afghan government. They had guys who could fly planes. That is true, and that'll probably happen again. But right now, the Taliban is understanding what their next or what their current weakness is, and that is that defense against air assets. So right now they're just going around and killing Air Force pilots. So I think you're going to have another issue there where you're going to have pilots who, I'm not going to say they're afraid to do their job. I do think that maybe the Afghan Special Forces and their Air Force pilots do have a little bit of a better mentality than the conventional ANA that we're seeing just lay down their arms. But it's going to make life really difficult when they have to worry about while they're in the air and while they're on the ground. more so than they already have to.
Well, there's not going to be an army to fly close air support for at the end of the day. I mean, and if I was a Afghan Air Force pilot getting intimidated, man, I'd be like, yeah, I don't know if I'd get in that cockpit anymore. I mean, if you get a family and stuff to support, I mean, what's the point? You know, it kind of feels like the writing's on the wall.
If I'm an Afghan pilot and I don't have a family to support, I'm sure I can fly to Uzbekistan.
Yeah, I think before too, even when when we were there were stories of, obviously a lot of training has been invested, bringing the Afghan pilots over to train them on the various platforms in the U.S. Like for an American, I mean, an American Army helicopter pilot is spending, I think, 15 months at their basic school for aviation, learn how to fly. So you had individuals who were who were going AWOL and seeing the writing on the wall then that, hey, maybe I should get out of here. And then also, I think, where you're drawing the pilots from, because I think, generally speaking, there's sort of a trend in most militaries that the Air Force, and we're joking about it before, having a more luxurious lifestyle and having those, fancy Breitling and Rolex watches, but they tend to be drawn from, the officer corps, the pilots tend to be drawn from higher stations in society, and the same can be said for Afghanistan. So a lot of the pilots, some of the pilots I encountered, they're English speaking. They're probably, a closer approximation to a middle class. These are people who don't, if they see their way of life threatened, they're probably, and again, not to disparage, I think there are some people who put, their pride of country or their pride of their conviction in doing the right thing and trying to fight against the Taliban and their way of life, ahead of that. But we're all human at the end of the day, and I think those who have families are probably thinking to themselves, well, how do I get out, and how do I provide safety and security for my family? So you may see not just the bleeding of talent by the Taliban killing them, but also the bleeding of talent by Afghan pilots fleeing to friendlier countries.
And it's not unheard of to take their aircraft with them. That happened several times during the peak of the Cold War. Yeah. Like both our pilots, some of our pilots fled to the Soviet Union or to Soviet Union allied states, and a lot of Soviet pilots defected as well that way. They'd load their family up in an aircraft and just take off and go land in NATO someplace.
Yeah, Tajikistan's taking refugees. That's the word on the street. So.
Yeah.
I'd try to go someplace nicer. How much fuel's in one of those A-29s? You think you could make it?
You could probably make it to India. I'm for sure you could make it to India.
Iran, if you're Shia, and you're in the Northwest.
You're gonna
it'll be interesting.
F-16.
I think it'll be interesting to see what happens to, I don't know if we talked about how you've got the traditional Afghan Air Force, but then you have the special mission wing.
No,
so
I don't
kind
think
of their, okay, so, I guess they would be sort of the equivalent of like the 160th SOAR in our world. So basically the Afghan Special Operations Community has their own dedicated air wing. And much like Afghan Special Operations, they are kind of a separate, they tend to be of a higher, better trained, more proficient, but they have their own, fixed and rotary wing aircraft. So I think now they've probably gone to the Black Hawks. I think they have A-29s, so they have strike capability. And they certainly, when I was there, had the airborne ISR, a manned platform called the PC-12. But I think what's going to be interesting to see is generally, I think that, Afghan SOF is much better than the conventional folks, and I wonder if it's going to mean anything. If this, I don't know. I mean, I think they're probably overtaxed. They're probably going to be just like their ground counterparts. Who were being misused and misallocated. I mean, maybe as things get worse, they'll be overextended. But there are capabilities there that they have, and I think they also have an unmanned capability too, not a strike platform, but a Scan Eagle, I think is what they have. So I am curious to see how they're being used currently, how they might be using CAS, differentiating from the way that we do it. I do know that when we would go on these EAPs, and we would bring Apaches for our own protection, and the Afghans would kind of point and look and say, "Hey, when are you going to bring those over and fight the Taliban with them?" And it was a very tough conversation for the advisors to say, "Oh, they're not for you; they're to protect us, because we care more about our ass than yours." What was the Dari phrase? Tolya Zai. It was like all together. Yeah, not so much. I remember being in Uruzgan at TK, and I think that was the one advising mission where I was like, they don't want us here because they clearly see that we are not bringing close air support for ourselves. We're bringing as a contingency for in the event that it got really bad, that Americans might be at risk.
Yeah. Well,
and I remember you talking about that, Adam, at the time.
I was just gonna say for the point about Scan Eagle, given the tendency of Scan Eagles to crash into everything, I assume they're not going to get great effects out of them. And two, don't they have little birds? Isn't that something
they do?
Well, I don't know.
I'd say once their Scan Eagle crashes, they're not getting another one.
Yeah.
Do you remember the cargo plane, the C-208 that they had? And there was an attempt to convert it into an ISR platform using a $2,000 or $3,000 digital camera, like a Canon, like an SLR camera.
Strap a GoPro to a cargo aircraft.
So essentially, that was the plan, and that was part of some of the advising efforts. Was to so this C-208, this maybe like a 6 or an 8 seater utility aircraft, which has a pretty busy mission plate to begin with. It's used as an air ambulance. It's used to restock some of the smaller Afghan bases because it doesn't need long runways to take off or land from. And so there was an idea that we have this several $1,000 Canon digital camera with a big zoom lens on it, and maybe we can use this to do ISR. And this got a little bit of traction until you realize that you can't, when you're geotagging from the camera, you're not getting grids to the location of where you're pointing the camera at. You're getting grids to the location of the aircraft. So your grids are kind of useless. I mean, maybe with a little bit of open source intelligence you could figure it out, but it's not like the average Afghan could take that footage and get those pictures and get a definitive grid off of it. And the fact that there was some trust issues going on there, which I think is a recurring theme in the long war in Afghanistan, that the camera was kept in a safe and only like 1 or 2 people had access to it. So I don't know if it did fly once or twice, and I did see pictures from it, and it kind of looked like the pictures that I snapped from when I took one of the converted Learjets that some of the government agencies were using to shuttle their people around. It was JLO's old G6 that was being used to fly some of these other government agencies around. I just took some shots when we were flying over the mountains. I was like, that's about the same quality that I got from the.
Our planes were bought from eBay. The first Mars birds were bought from eBay as part of the Air Force acquisition. They bought some Las Vegas, I guess, private business owners, King Air 350s, converted them. So probably a lot of cool orgies happening on those planes. Not while we were there, but in their past life. Hey, thanks everybody for tuning in to this episode of the Boardwalk podcast. We'd like to thank Adam for coming on and sharing a little bit about what it's like to task ISR assets, to kind of talk about the Afghan Air Force and maybe project a little bit about the future. Make sure to hit up our Instagram page. I mean, we regularly post episode updates on there. Hit us up on Facebook, the Boardwalk Podcast. Zach and all of his boomer friends are probably on there every day, just commenting and leaving emojis on all of our posts. So be sure to check that out. And thanks for listening. Tell your friends.